Okay, welcome back, and this episode will be focusing exclusively on how my second round league game against Rondom wrapped up. So at this point I'm still playing two games, a historical defence against Sotakahu and a long opening against Rondom. And it's November 1944 when we get poor and severe weather. The summer fighting is over on the Eastern Front and I am well beyond the treaty line. Barring some spectacular luck for the British forces ashore in France, this is going to lead into a one endgame. Why? Technically we're still in the mid-game at this point, so why is this position definitely lost for the Allies? Partly it's because it's a long war and the endgame is always stronger for the Axis in a long war. Partly it's because I have a persistent med lock which is shifting things. And also because I've got this very advanced position on the Eastern Front. In fact, this is the first time in a game that I've ever reduced the Soviet faction post-1943 to zero national will. That doesn't actually have any game effect, but it shows how well things are going. Rondom makes good use of the surprise marker here in January. If the Sevastopol landing can hold, it stretches the Axis line and it should be possible to buy it back in time for the summer. My general preference in the endgame is to switch the Soviet fleet to the Baltic, but that's not an option here because Leningrad is in German hands. Ouch! A German unit explodes and I'm just glad the Soviets have nothing to push through the gap. This is a problem that occurs anywhere the Germans have a single unit responsible for a 3-hex section, and the Soviet players should try to take advantage of it. Let's take a quick look at the combat table to explain that. In general, in bad weather, you have to settle for occasional retreats, and those are best achieved the way they are in any turn, by generating as many attacks that have at least a positive DRM as possible. But secondarily, you have the possibilities around DD or DE results. German units are not invulnerable. If you can muster a +7, you have a chance of generating a DE result. A better chance against minor allies. And no, it's not worth spending the partisans to do that. You need to be using the partisans to ensure the Germans are at 9 factories lost. But it is worth spending the artillery and tank markers and a small amount of air power to achieve this. And a Soviet player should be able to generate at least half a dozen and probably closer to a dozen high DRM attacks over the course of the winter. And that gives pretty good odds at least one of them will convert into a hole in the German lines, if you place them in the right places. But where are the right places? Well, here's the German position in January, and generally speaking it's easier to break through in the south where the terrain is more open, but the thing you should be looking for are Axis units which can be attacked on 3 sides. That gives you the opportunity to spend 2 tank markers, or to use 2 shock armies. I've marked here how many angles a German unit could be attacked from. Obviously the 1s are a bit of a waste. So in general, concentrate on the 3s. Then ask how much impact will that attack have. I've marked for each exploitable hex how much it can be exploited. I've left the 3s that cannot be exploited marked. You can see the real prize here is Tula. DE at Tula would cut off another German unit and gain 2 hexes. And that also indicates I should have positioned the fallback, the Romanian unit at Orel, 1 hex to the east in order to limit that exploitation. The Panzer west of Bologoy and the 1st Para southeast of Riege offer similar gains, but they are tough units to shift. Beyond this, you need to look for advantageous DRs to gain a hex. And by April, the Soviets have made a few hexes around Tula and in the north, but now our attention needs to turn to the west. This is about as strong as the Axis forces can make the Atlantic Wall. 5 Luftwaffe units cover most landing points. There are 4 armoured units available to concentrate against any landings. I have plenty of ground to give, and I have begun to give up defending my med lock. if the Western forces spend surprise markers on the Med now, I will be over the moon. My objective is to repulse if possible, and if not, to contain any Western landing in France. On the Eastern Front, I'll simply be in full-blown retreat, sacrificing units of minor allies and garrisons to buy me time. Rondom plays for a poor weather landing. I wouldn't. I would have waited another turn for fair weather. The first attempt is at the Bay of Biscay, but it fails to the crossfire of interceptions. The second attempt is at Cherbourg. It fails on a 1-4. I would not have recommended Cherbourg as a target. It's -1 for landing in the city, and the unit has no retreat, so you need a DD result to shift a full strength unit. It's hard to land against this sort of Atlantic wall. The key to have any chance is to try and find a weakness and land everything at that point. The reason is, even if you fail, you want to make it hard enough to repulse it and tie down enough German resources to give the Soviets room to deliver a serious blow on the Eastern Front. And that means you have to get ashore. And so I would absolutely wait for fair weather. It makes a big difference on your odds. But let's look at some of the options, starting with Antwerp. An aircraft carrier escorted by a fighter cannot be stopped by German interception. However, you cannot use the partisan marker on Antwerp because it's not occupied territory, and you have no air support, so you can't use the paratroops either. So I would want to set conditions for landing there by landing northeast of Calais first. To give you a sense of how tough this can be, if you use the airdrop and the partisan to counter German air and the tank marker, you are still only going to be looking at a 22 in 36 chance of getting ashore. You can push that to 25 in 36 by dropping Ultra and the free forces into the mix. If you succeed and have a Mulberry marker available, you could then cycle in UK and US fighters to suppress Axis air assets and provide air support for a landing at Antwerp. Antwerp would then have a 3 in 4 chance of getting ashore. But obviously, there's quite a strong possibility of this failing, and only about a 50-50 chance of getting both units ashore. The other possibility would be to land around Brest. The problem is that you won't take a port in the process, but you have a much better chance of getting ashore, especially with some substantial investment of carrier strikes. I've never had to land against this kind of defence, and when I've seen other experienced players do it, they've tended to avoid it entirely and either go into Spain or into Scandinavia and bypass France when faced with it, trying to draw off the defenders to other locations. Fair weather in the east for May, so now the retreat begins. Note, I only have 11 full-strength German units on the Eastern Front, so retreat is the only option. But I have plenty of ground to give, and I can redirect units from other locations, so it's not a big deal. I've marked my intended first defensive line, and likely the position of the second. Meanwhile, the units of minor allies and garrisons will be thrown into the front line to act as a layer of ablative armour, holding more difficult terrain in pockets to slow down the Soviet advance. Note that I'm giving a lot of ground in the south, but I'm also much further east than the northern troops, and I don't want to risk a pocket. Ultimately, I want to straighten the line as I fall back to match the northwest-southeast grain of the hexes, because that takes advantage of the hex geometry to aid the defence. Only 2 units can attack together rather than 3. You can see the impact the sacrificial line has. The Soviets churned through 11 units, but they burnt up air resources, and most of the Soviet units are now 3 to 4 hexes shy of the German line. I'll have to give a little more ground in the centre, which is a bit exposed, but I should be able to hold very close to my defensive line next round, especially if I get poor weather in June. Also here, note the impact the weather has. May and June can be poor weather, so this moment could have been July. Okay, A few notes on the defensive line. The Soviets are short of air power in the south, where I've managed to set up another sacrificial line. They have to get through that to attack 3rd Panzer, which is probably the most vulnerable point, because I haven't set up a secondary line behind it. I have secondary lines north of Veliki Luki and south of Kiev. I can afford that risk in the centre because of the concentration of strong units there, and partly because of supply, which does not run through the Pripyat marshes. A breakthrough without forcing the positions to the north will just basically run out of supply. Note, I am now at 14 units on the front, and that will rise to 16 next turn. The Western forces will recover their landing capacity in August and September, but I can afford to strip the west of France of frontline units. I don't actually need to stop a Western landing in late summer, just contain it, so that the Western forces are well short of the German border at the end of the year. The Soviets will always break through. They have 20 units. They're going to throw at least one 6-1 in the round. In this case, most of the success came against Finland in the north, but they have managed to get a stranglehold on 1st Panzer here in the south. So it's time to talk about breakouts. The most common beginner error I see in late German defences is to attempt to use the unit that is surrounded to attack the surrounding units in ways that don't actually achieve anything. The big cats thrash around, they burn up production points, but they don't actually kill Soviet units or successfully break out of the encirclement. In this case, the 1st Panzer has a chance of liberating itself if it attacks to the northwest and successfully destroys the guard unit. Then it'll place a no enemy zone of control marker, and that will allow it to escape. But the odds on that are not great. The Soviets will probably spend air and or tank markers to try and maintain the hold. And that creates a 10 in 36 chance of an AS result, which will just stop the Panzer dead. The alternative is to try and relieve the Panzer by attacking with units to break the encirclement. It's not that that won't work, it almost certainly will, whatever the Soviets spend. It's that those units are then tied down into a slugging match with Soviet units. They run a serious risk of losing, and thus you are throwing more national will into the pot. This is in fact what I did here. I don't really think it was the right move. It wasn't inherently a bad move. The Soviets are short on troops and air, and there was a chance of holding the line even in the open here, but ultimately it did cost me quite badly. What you'll often see experienced players do in this sort of situation is a simple sack, bringing a unit such as the Romanians to hold the hex west of the 1st Panzer, allowing the supply to get through temporarily and momentarily stopping the isolate bonus. This is exactly the same principle as a Soviet defence. Units which are in supply and not isolated resist longer and cost more movement points to overcome. So simply sacrificing one unit to boost that supply is usually worth it. And yes, the Soviets do in fact achieve 2 partial breakthroughs. My losses were 2 Panzers and the para unit, but I should be able to reform the line to make a stand for September, though probably have to give a bit more ground in the north and centre than I planned to. But I'm still hopeful that I'm going to be in the cold weather zone at the end of the year. Rondom gets ashore at Brest and I don't manage to retake it, but there's not going to be any major breakout from that port, and I reduce the fleet and convoy. I've talked about cycling in previous episodes. Rondom still isn't cycling the units properly, and that's making it much easier to suppress these landings. It's legitimate to wonder why I fell back so far in the north on the Eastern Front, but there's no point in taking any risks here. This shortens the German line, and I don't care as long as I can hold things in the cold zone. Why am I so concerned with the cold zone? Well, the endgame comes in 3 parts: the final summer offensive, the winter rebuild, and the final offensive. which is always a short offensive. The main determining factor is the length of those offensives. In particular, the final turns in the very final offensive. In the fair weather zone, March or April can be fair weather. They can't be fair weather in the cold zone, and it's less likely that May and June will be. So simply by holding the Soviets in the cold zone, you're eliminating the possibility of the more extreme weather events, which will disadvantage you as the Axis player. Okay, pick a retreat path time. I'll give you a moment if you want to pause the video and think about this one. The unit has been disrupted by the 6th Guards attacks, which is very close to being out of movement points. Where should it retreat to? The answer is southeast into the city. You see, the Russian tank shouldn't be following up after this combat at all. Instead, one of the guard units should move through into the vacated hex. That'll cost it 3 movement points, which means it will have enough movement points for 2 attacks on the disrupted unit. There's a good chance of it blowing up the German unit, and even if it doesn't blow it up, there's a decent chance of getting a DR result. If the German unit retreats west on that result, then a DR will cut off one German unit to the north, and blowing up on the spot and creating no zone of control will just be a total disaster. We're well into the winter and we get one last serious attempt at an amphibious landing by the Allies. The first one comes against Corunna in Spain and is the only one to get ashore. It is a preparatory attack which disrupts the Italian fleet I've based there and paves the way for an attempt at a landing at Le Havre, which bounces on a 1-4 roll, and then a landing in the Bay of Biscay, which is intercepted by the German surface action, which was only about a 1 in 12 chance. My opponent has had lousy luck on the landings. I totally forgot that Portugal is in the game, and the Allies grab another port and get within 2 hexes of Madrid due to the error. Oh dear. But I have no particular difficulty overwhelming the landing forces. This is a point worth making about Spain. The ports are very spread out, working around the coast, 7 ports over 26 hexes of coast. So in a landing, each port has to support 3 or 4 units to maintain the front that's protecting the port. Whereas in northern France, where the ports are tightly packed, each port generally only has to support 1 or 2 units. And that subtle strain on the supply is why Spanish landings often fail in unexpected ways. So, with the last Allied invasion repulsed, the Soviets stuck in the cold zone, this game really is over. In the end, there were 3 turns of fair weather in the mild zone, but neither the Allies nor the Soviets were able to take advantage of it. I had 78 national will in April, and the game ended with a very dramatic Axis victory, which was not a complete surprise. I've broadly come to the opinion that the long opening in this version of the game is the strongest opening, and this was the first long opening I'd played in the league. In fact, it was the first long opening that anybody had played in the league, and Rondom, of course, wasn't familiar with the long opening theory, so I was playing at a substantial advantage. That's wrapped up my game against Rondom. The next round of the league kicked off just before it finished, and I have Rondom again, this time with Rondom playing the Axis, and I have WKSP with the Allies. We'll see how those games go in the next episode, but first let's look at some results and data from the first 2 rounds of the league. Which, remember, each round of the league you play 1 Axis game and 1 Allied game, so 2 rounds of the league is 4 games from each player who competed. In the third round, the league has been divided into two tiers, referred to as experienced and beginners, and initially players simply self-select which one they want to be in. So it's probably appropriate at this point to give some standings from the first two rounds. For the moment, I've just organised it by games won. That second column of numbers is the league's tiebreaker, which is total national will for the respective factions. It's not actually a good tiebreaker because it doesn't really work in allied victories, and it doesn't work well when one side resigns, and most games end in a resignation. And straight victories isn't an ideal condition because it's unlikely going forward that players will have an equal number of games. For example, Sotokahu, who I suspect is going to go 4 for 4 in the first two rounds, has only actually completed one game, and so decided not to compete in the third round of the league. 7 players have moved forward to participate in the third round, with some choosing to skip a round and others to voluntarily drop down to the less experienced league, and 5 new players have joined. So how, in this sort of situation, do you measure a player's lifetime performance across different league rounds? The answer is a percentage of wins, but with a small number of dummy losses. I am for the moment going to use 1. For example, if a player has 1 win but has only completed 1 game, they get 50%. 1 divided by 1 game played plus 1 dummy loss. And here are the standings after the first 2 rounds, with no great surprises that WKSP, Cornet of Horse and Mark Day top the list. I'm going to be using this method going forward to report overall league standings, but from the third round onwards I'm only going to record games a player plays in the top league towards their standings. Let's add the second round into our count of the openings. We have a bunch more historical openings starting to show a bit of favour for the Allies. My defence against Sotokahu, Kamba's second round game, are still outstanding. We've got 3 more Western Italys taking place in this round, which takes us up to 5. So Western Italy is very common as the games stand, looking at around 20% of the games. It seems that results in part from inexperienced players not taking the threat seriously, though it's worth noting the design team have latched onto it as a serious problem and are apparently rewriting the diplomacy rules. I would not read too much into the relative success of different openings here. There is a huge variation in player skill, and it's as likely to be a result of matchups as anything else. Anyway, I'll see you next time when the third round commences.